I hid the birth of our twins from my ex-husband. 8 years later, he was diagnosed with infertility, and his family's company decided to remove him from the CEO position. Just as the shareholders' meeting was about to begin, I arrived with the 2 children. New York City, 10 a.m. Pale yellow sunlight streamed through the reinforced glass of a Wall Street skyscraper. Yet, the atmosphere in my office was unusually cold. Not the chill of the air conditioning, but the icy dread emanating from the crimson numbers dancing across my computer screen. I sat silently on my ergonomic chair, eyes fixed on the free-falling candlestick chart of TMG, the Sterling Group. That was the empire I had walked away from 8 years ago, and it was also the place that held the bittersweet memories of my youth. The ring of my desk phone shattered the stillness. It was Sarah, a senior legal counsel and my closest friend in Los Angeles. "Hello, Amy, I'm here," I answered, trying to keep my voice calm despite the turmoil within. On the other end, Sarah's voice was urgent, completely devoid of the usual composure of a seasoned lawyer. "Amy, have you seen the ticker? Sterling is crashing. Things are really tense. I just got a confidential tip from inside. Dan had an accident." My fingers tightened around the receiver. Dan. I hadn't uttered that name, or deliberately avoided it, for 8 years. But my heart didn't skip a beat now out of worry for old affections. Instead, a heightened investor's caution took hold. "What kind of accident? Is his life in danger, Sarah?" I asked, my eyes still glued to the computer screen, where Sterling's market capitalization was evaporating by billions of dollars in just a few minutes. "Broken leg. In a cast. Not life-threatening. But the problem isn't the soft tissue injury or the prospect of a few weeks in a wheelchair." Sarah lowered her voice as if afraid of being overheard. "The problem is that, taking advantage of Dan's hospitalization, an old medical record supposedly belonging to him was leaked. It concludes that Dan is congenitally infertile due to complications from mumps in childhood. Mr. Sterling's faction is spreading rumors that Dan has kept this secret for years to hold on to his position. You know, with a family corporation like Sterling, the head absolutely being unable to produce an heir is a fatal blow." I smirked faintly. Congenital infertility? This play by Mr. Faved. Sterling is truly venomous. He wants to cut off all of Dan's lifelines. But if they knew I was raising 2 perfect replicas of him right here, those shareholders would surely be stunned. "Is it old man Sterling doing this?" I asked directly. "Precisely," Sarah affirmed. "That vice chairman has been waiting for this opportunity for a decade now. He's stirring up investment funds, spreading rumors that Sterling will hit a dead end because Dan will never have an heir. He's called an emergency shareholders meeting for next week. His sole purpose is to oust Dan and put his own faction in power." I lightly spun the signing pen in my hand. Mr. Sterling, the cunning fox on the board. In the past, when I was still a daughter-in-law of the Sterling family, he never considered me anything. In his eyes, and my ex-mother-in-law Eleanor Sterling's eyes, I was just a girl from a humble background, bringing no benefit to Dan's chairman's seat. "What's the current stock price?" I asked, a purely professional question. It's been limit down for 3 consecutive sessions. Small investors are panic selling. Mr. Sterling's faction is quietly accumulating shares to increase their voting power. "Amy, listen, if Dan loses his position, his assets will be torn apart. Do you understand what this means?" I understood perfectly. Too perfectly. I didn't care if Dan remained CEO or not, nor was I concerned about whether he lived or died under his harsh mother's thumb, but I cared about Ben and Hannah. My 2 children, they carried the Sterling family bloodline. They were the first legitimate heirs by law. The assets of Sterling Holdings, in theory, would one day belong to my children. If I allowed Mr. Sterling to take over and siphon off the corporation, transforming Sterling into his family's private playground, then what Ben and Hannah would receive in the future would be nothing but an empty shell. "Sarah." I cut across Sarah's train of thought, my voice sharp. "I'm coming back." "You're coming back? Are you going public?" Sarah hesitated. "I'm coming back to collect a debt." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking down at the glistening lights of the city. 8 years ago, Eleanor Sterling threw a check for $500,000 in my face to buy her son's freedom. She called me a parasite, clinging to her son to milk his money. Now, I would show her who truly held the destiny of that family. I was no longer the naive college graduate, crying and begging for my in-laws' affection, as I was back then. I was Amy, the portfolio manager of Vision Capital for the Southeast Asia region. In my hands, I held not just money, but the power of knowledge and information. Book me the earliest flight tomorrow and prepare all legal documents regarding the shares I hold through various nominee accounts. Oh, and the DNA reports for Ben and Hannah too, internationally notarized copies. Sarah sighed with relief on the other end. All right, I've been waiting for you to say that for a long time. Saving Dan's position seems like a losing battle, but the important thing is to teach a lesson to those who scorned you and your children. Hanging up, I returned to my desk. The screen still glowed red with the color of collapse, but in my eyes, it was the color of opportunity. People often say to be greedy when others are fearful. Now, as the entire market turned its back on Sterling, was precisely when I would step in. I opened a drawer and took out a photo of my 2 children and me on a trip to Disneyland. Ben, with a serious expression, held a model airplane, while Hannah giggled, hugging my neck. These 2 children were my entire world. For them, I had tasted enough bitterness, from washing dishes for hire, waiting tables, to sleepless nights studying for my CFA charter. I would not allow anyone, be it the cunning Mr. Sterling or the harsh Eleanor Sterling, to harm even a single penny of the inheritance that belonged to my children. I pressed the intercom to call my assistant into the room. Jessica, cancel all my meetings this week. I have an urgent business trip to the U.S. and prepare a plan for me to buy a large volume of TMG shares. We're going to play a big game. Jessica looked at me in surprise, but accustomed to her boss's decisive style, she nodded immediately. Yes, ma'am. How long will you be gone? Until I reclaim what belongs to me, I answered, my sharp gaze fixed on the indefinite space. The game had only just begun. 8 years ago, I left as a failure. This time, I would return as the dealer. My luxurious penthouse apartment, spacious and airy, overlooked the Hudson River. Upon arriving home, I saw Ben building Lego on the living room rug, while Hannah was busy painting. The twins, 8 years old this year, had completely opposite personalities. Ben was quiet, mature for his age, and had a strange fascination with numbers. Hannah was lively, sensitive, and very observant. "Mommy's home," Hannah cried out, abandoning her painting to hug my legs. I knelt down and kissed my daughter's cheek, then ruffled Ben's hair. The boy looked up, his dark eyes, identical to Dan's, intently studying me. "You're home early, Mom? Did the market close early today?" I chuckled. At 8 years old, his questions were no different from a stockbroker's. "No, son, I'm home to pack. Tomorrow, we're going on a trip." I tried to keep my voice as cheerful as possible. "Where are we going, Mom?" Hannah asked, her eyes wide. "To the U.S., I said. To your mom's homeland." My heart suddenly ached a little at the mention of homeland. That place held beautiful memories but also many unhealed scars. Ben stopped building, looking straight into my eyes. "To the place where Sterling Corp is, that company you often check the charts for, right, Mom?" I was stunned for a moment. I had never told my children who their father was or how wealthy their paternal family was. I only told them their father was away on a very distant business trip. But Ben was too smart. He had researched it himself online, piecing together the fragmented information he overheard when I was on the phone. "That's right, Ben." "How did you know?" I asked gently. "I saw you often track the TMG ticker. I Googled it and found the CEO of that group is named Daniel Sterling. My middle name and Hannah's middle name are also Sterling. And he..." Ben hesitated a moment. "He looks a lot like me in the mirror." I sat down on the rug, pulling both children into my arms. Their intelligence and sensitivity made me both proud and heartbroken. They should have grown up surrounded by both parents, living the life of comfort they were entitled to. But because of the narrow-mindedness of adults, they had lived without their paternal family's affection for the past 8 years. I'm sorry I haven't told you everything, I said, stroking Ben's hair. Yes, we are going back there. I have an important job to do, a job related to your future. Are we going to collect money, Mom? Hannah innocently asked. Like when the electricity bill collector came to our door the other day. I burst out laughing, dispelling the somber atmosphere. Something like that, my dear. But this time, Mom is going to collect a very large sum of money. The diaper and formula money they owe you too for 8 years. That night, after putting my children to sleep, I sat alone on the balcony, swirling a glass of red wine. Memories of 8 years ago flooded back like a slow-motion film. That rainy night, Mrs. Sterling slammed a check for $500,000 onto the table. Her eyes looked at me with utter contempt. Take this money and get out of Dan's life. Look at yourself. What makes you worthy of being a CEO's wife? No outstanding beauty, no powerful backing. You can't even do the simple job of bearing children. The Sterling family doesn't harbor barren daughters-in-law like you. At that time, I was 2 months pregnant, but I kept it a secret. I intended to surprise Dan on our anniversary. But Mrs. Sterling's cruelty and Dan's silence, his busy and indifferent neglect during that time, crushed my hopes. I took that check, not because I was greedy for money, but because I needed it to raise my child. I wiped away my tears, signed the pre-written divorce papers, and left that very night with my suitcase. $50,000. To an ordinary person, it was a fortune, but to Sterling Holdings, it was just a grain of sand. I used that very money, coupled with my resentment, as motivation to invest, to study, to rise up in this unfamiliar country. From the initial $500,000 through sleepless nights analyzing the market and daring investments in tech startups, I multiplied that capital 100-fold. Now I returned, not as a scorned wife, but as a financial shark. I looked down at the twinkling city lights below. This gamble wasn't just about money, it was about honor. I wanted Mrs. Sterling to see the daughter-in-law she once drove away, and the position I now held. I wanted Dan to regret not protecting my children and me. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Everything is ready. Car will pick you up at LAX at 8 a.m. tomorrow. The media team is also prepared. You just need to shine. I texted back a single word. Okay. Draining my wine glass, I felt the blood in my veins heating up, no longer the weak, pathetic person of the past. Tomorrow, when my plane landed at LAX, was also when the order of Sterling Holdings would be rearranged. I stood up and walked into the bedroom, gazing at my 2 sleeping angels. Ben lay on his side, still clutching his teddy bear, while Hannah spread her arms and legs, taking up the entire bed. Sleep tight, my darlings, I whispered. Tomorrow, Mommy will reclaim everything that rightfully belongs to us. The flight landed at Los Angeles International Airport around midday. The intense heat of Southern California hit me as soon as I stepped out of the international terminal, bringing with it the familiar smell of exhaust fumes mixed with a hint of tropical humidity. It had been 8 years. The feeling, both strange and dear, made me pause for a second. I wore a finely tailored white pantsuit, highlighting my slender figure, and large sunglasses that covered more than half my face. Ben and Hannah walked on either side of me, dressed smartly like 2 child models. They looked around curiously. This was their first time visiting their paternal homeland. It's so hot, Mom. Hannah scrunched up her face and pulled my sleeve. It'll be cool in the car, honey, I reassured her, quickly scanning the crowd, waiting to greet their loved ones. Sarah was already there, waving. Beside her was a luxurious, gleaming black car. Sarah looked as sharp as ever, with a stylish short haircut and a power suit that exuded authority. Welcome home, beautiful. Sarah embraced me, then knelt to look at the children, her eyes sparkling. My goodness, they're identical. This must be Ben, and this little princess is Hannah, right? Hello, Aunt Sarah. The children politely folded their arms and greeted her in unison. Their slightly accented English, from living abroad, sounded endearing. Good children, let's get in the car. Auntie has gifts for you two. Sarah opened the car door, urging us to move quickly to avoid attracting attention. The car sped through the bustling city streets. I took off my sunglasses and accepted the thick folder Sarah handed me. This is the latest quarterly financial report, the updated shareholder list from this morning, and the agenda for tomorrow's emergency shareholders meeting, Sarah said quickly, her manner professional. The situation is worse than I thought. Mr. Sterling's faction now controls about 35% of the voting shares. Dan and his family hold 30%. The rest belongs to investment funds and small shareholders. If Mr. Sterling convinces the neutral group, Dan will lose his seat. I quickly flipped through the documents. The numbers danced before my eyes, but they didn't confuse me. Instead, they made the overall picture clearer. Sterling was still a company with good fundamentals. Its P/E ratio was attractive, but investor confidence was being eroded by rumors about the heir. "How much do you hold?" Sarah asked. "Personally, I hold 5%, accumulated gradually over the past 2 years under nominee companies, and the Vision Capital Fund, which I represent, holds 10%. In total, I have 15% voting power," I answered clearly. Sarah whistled. 15% plus Dan's 30% is 45%. Still not enough for a 100% majority win, but enough to veto Mr. Sterling's critical decisions. "This game is getting interesting." "Mom!" Ben's voice came from the back seat. He was holding my tablet, intently studying a chart. "I think Dad's company is unfairly undervalued." Sarah started, turning to look at the boy. "How do you know?" "Amy's Ben." Ben pointed at the screen, his voice young but his reasoning firm. "Auntie, look at this. The company's fixed assets are very large, debt is low, and cash flow from operations is still positive. The only reason for the price drop is panic. If good news is released now, the price will rebound in a V-shaped pattern. This is a buying opportunity, not a selling one." Sarah and I stared at each other in astonishment. Sarah's mouth hung open. "Amy, how did you raise such a prodigy? He's only 8, but he analyzes like a Wall Street expert." I smiled proudly. His dad's genes. But honed by his mom, Sarah shook her head in admiration. "With this boy's appearance, plus your 15% stake, I'm sure old man Sterling will have a stroke." The car turned onto the street, leading to a 5-star hotel in downtown Los Angeles. I looked out the window and saw the Sterling Tower soaring majestically into the sky in the distance. That was where I would step in tomorrow, not to beg, but to declare war. "Sarah, arrange an informal meeting with the neutral shareholders for me tonight, please," I ordered. "I want to gauge their intentions before the crucial hour." "Done. I'll take care of it." "But are you going to inform Dan beforehand?" Sarah asked. I shook my head decisively. "No. The element of surprise is the key to victory. I want to see his face, and that entire family's face, when I walk into that meeting room tomorrow." Hannah sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "Mom, are we going to see Dad tomorrow?" I stroked her hair, my heart sinking a little. "Yes, honey, tomorrow you'll meet your dad. Does Dad like us, Mom?" Hannah's innocent question tightened my heart. For 8 years, Dan had no idea of the children's existence. How would he react? Joy, suspicion, or denial, like his mother had done to me? "Dad will love you very much because you are the most wonderful children," I said, but a hint of uncertainty remained within me. No matter how meticulously I prepared financially, human emotions were still the most unpredictable variable. The car stopped in front of the hotel lobby. The door opened, and the flash of a few paparazzi cameras lit up. It seemed that information about a mysterious investor returning from overseas had been leaked somewhere. I pulled my sunglasses down, held my head high, and tightly grasping my children's hands, stepped into the lobby. There was no turning back from this return. On the morning of the shareholders' meeting, the Los Angeles sky was unusually clear, a stark contrast to the turbulent moods of those working in the Sterling Tower. I chose a deep navy pantsuit, minimalist in design but exuding cold authority. Ben and Hannah were also dressed smartly, looking like 2 little angels from a fashion magazine. Sarah's car brought my 2 children and me directly to the main lobby. As soon as I stepped out, I felt dozens of eyes turn towards me. Staff, security guards, and even small shareholders gathered, buzzing with conversations. All fell silent at the sight of my children and me. I held my head high, holding my children's hands, walking across the gleaming marble floor. The sound of my heels echoed crisply. But just as I prepared to head towards the VIP elevator reserved for the board of directors, a muscular arm blocked my path. "Excuse me, ma'am. This area is reserved for board members and major shareholders with special invitation cards. Please present your card," the head security guard said stiffly, looking at me with suspicion. He probably didn't recognize me, the ex-wife who had been shamefully cast out 8 years ago. I hadn't even had time to reply when a shrill, mocking voice rang out from behind. Well, who do we have here? Isn't this Mr. Sterling's ex-wife who got kicked to the curb?" I turned around. Standing there was Michael, Mr. Sterling's only son. He wore a flashy gray suit, his hair slicked back with gel, his face exuding the arrogant air of someone born with a silver spoon but limited talent. Michael stepped forward, looking me up and down, then curled his lip in a sneer. "What's up, Amy? Heard Sterling was in trouble, so you came back for some charity? Or are you planning to use old affections to beg Dan to take you back? Let me tell you, Dan is too busy trying to keep his seat. He doesn't have time for gold diggers like you." Hannah, frightened, huddled behind my legs. Ben glared at Michael, his small hands clenched. I gently squeezed Ben's hand to reassure him, then looked straight into Michael's eyes, my gaze so calm it unsettled him slightly. "Michael, 8 years, and you still have that same crude way of speaking," I said, my voice icy. "I'm here to attend the shareholders' meeting, not to bicker with someone who lacks the authority to determine the company's fate." Michael burst into raucous laughter, his voice echoing through the large lobby, drawing everyone's attention. "Attend the meeting? You're hilarious. In what capacity? As the former housemaid? Or the wife who was thrown out for not being able to have children?" Michael's words were like a sharp knife, but they no longer caused me pain as they once did. They only strengthened my resolve to crush his family's arrogance under my heel. I didn't bother to reply to him, pulling out my phone and dialing Lucy, the chief board secretary, directly. "Lucy, I'm in the VIP lobby. Some unqualified individuals are obstructing a strategic shareholder. Please come down and escort me immediately, or I will sell all my shares to Sterling's competitors in this morning's trading session." I hung up, not giving Lucy a chance to react. Michael heard the call. His face changed slightly, but he still tried to stand firm. "Strategic shareholder? If you're a strategic shareholder, I'll walk on my hands. Don't stand here putting on an act." I smiled, a cryptic half-smile. "Then you'd better start practicing your handstands." Just then, the VIP elevator doors opened. Lucy rushed out, followed by 2 senior security personnel. The experienced secretary was momentarily stunned when she saw me, but quickly regained her professional composure. "Welcome, Miss Miller," Lucy bowed, her respectful attitude a stark contrast to her indifference 8 years ago. "I apologize for the delay. Please, you and the children come up to the meeting room immediately." Michael's eyes widened, staring at Lucy. "Lucy, what the hell are you doing? Why are you inviting this woman up? My father will hear about this, and you'll be in trouble." Lucy turned to Michael, her voice stern. "Mr. Michael, this is a direct request from Chairman Sterling. Furthermore, Miss Miller is currently the authorized representative of Vision Capital, holding a very significant amount of shares. If you continue to obstruct, you will be held responsible by the board for damaging relations with an investor." Michael's face turned from red to ashen. He stammered, speechless. He looked at me, then at the 2 children beside me, as if he had just seen ghosts. I walked past him, whispering softly enough for him to hear, "Get out of the way. Useless." I led my children into the elevator, leaving Michael frozen in the lobby amidst the murmurs of the crowd. The elevator doors closed, concealing his distraught face. Lucy stood tucked into the corner of the elevator, secretly glancing at the 2 children, curiosity evident in her eyes. "Miss Miller," Lucy began hesitantly. "Who are these 2 children?" "They're my children," I replied concisely, offering no further explanation. The elevator smoothly ascended to the 68th floor, where the decisive battle would take place. I adjusted Ben's collar and smoothed Hannah's hair. "Almost there. Remember what Mom told you?" I whispered. Ben nodded firmly. "Yes, Mom." Observe silently and smile. Good. I took a deep breath, preparing myself to face the man I once loved more than life itself, and the woman who had once trampled on my self-respect. The elevator doors opened on the 68th floor, a space entirely different from the noisy, chaotic lobby below. Here, it was quiet, with thick, plush carpets, elegant wood-paneled walls, and the faint scent of sandalwood essential oil. This was the domain of Sterling's highest powers. Lucy led the way, with my children and me following behind. The long, silent corridor led to the main conference room. Suddenly, the door to the CEO's office opened. A man stepped out, leaning on a crutch, a stack of documents tucked under his other arm, looking hurried but struggling. It was Dan. 8 years seemed to have treated him exceptionally well. He looked more mature, more distinguished than before, despite the fine lines around his eyes and the visible fatigue on his handsome face. He wore a sharp, dark suit, exuding a cold, solitary aura. Dan was looking down at his documents and almost bumped into us. He looked up, about to apologize by reflex. "Excuse me, I didn't mean to." His words caught in his throat. The stack of documents in his hand fell to the floor, papers scattering everywhere. He stood frozen, his eyes wide, staring at me as if he couldn't believe his sight. "Amy," he gasped, his voice hoarse. I looked at him, trying to keep my heart from racing. "Hello, Dan. Long time no see." Dan's gaze shifted from my face to the 2 children standing beside me. In that instant, I saw his entire world collapse and then be reborn. He looked at Ben, then at Hannah. The uncanny resemblance between him and Ben made it impossible for anyone to deny their blood relation. Ben looked at his father, his dark eyes showing no fear, but full of curious scrutiny. Hannah was shyer, clutching my hand tightly. "These are?" Dan stammered, his voice trembling. He tossed his crutches aside, gritting his teeth against the pain, and laboriously knelt on his good leg to be at eye level with the children. Even though his other leg throbbed, causing sweat to bead on his forehead, his hand hovered in the air, wanting to touch their faces but pulling back, afraid of startling them. "These are Ben and Hannah," I introduced, my voice calm to the point of cruelty. "My children." "Your children?" Dan looked up at me, his eyes red. "How old are they?" 8 years old, I answered. Dan calculated in his head. 8 years. The time I left, a shocking truth struck his mind. He understood everything. When I left, I was carrying his blood. "Why?" Dan asked, his voice choked with pain. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide them from me for 8 years? I smiled faintly, bending down to help him pick up his documents. "You ask why? You should go ask your mother what she said and what she did that rainy night 8 years ago. And you, where were you then? You were busy with business trips, busy building this empire, having no time to care whether your wife lived or died." Dan lowered his head, regret flooding his eyes. He was about to say something, but hurried footsteps from the corridor cut him off. Mr. Sterling and a group of his faction's shareholders approached. Seeing Dan kneeling before my children and me, Mr. Sterling froze, his face filled with astonishment and suspicion. "Chairman Sterling, the meeting is about to begin." "What are you doing here?" Mr. Sterling said, then glanced at my children and me. When his eyes met Ben's face, I clearly saw a flicker of panic in the old fox's eyes. Dan stood up, leaning on the wall for balance, then picked up his crutches, quickly regaining the dignified demeanor of a chairman, but his eyes never left his 2 children. "I know. Let's go into the meeting," Dan said coldly to Mr. Sterling, then turned to me, his gaze softening. "Amy, why are you here?" "I'm here to save your seat," I said directly, "and to claim justice for my children." I took my children's hands, sidestepped Dan and Mr. Sterling, and walked straight towards the large conference room. Lucy rushed to open the door for me. Dan stood there, watching the backs of my children and me. His hands clenched. He knew today would be a historic day for Sterling and a fateful day for his life. Mr. Sterling watched, muttering curses under his breath. His perfect plan seemed to be on the verge of collapsing due to the sudden appearance of my children and me. In the conference room, the atmosphere was as tense as a snapping string. Shareholders filled every seat, and a large screen displayed charts of plummeting profits and stock prices. Everyone fell silent as the door opened. I walked in, proud and majestic. Ben and Hannah walked beside me, showing no fear of the unfamiliar crowd. They carried themselves with a natural confidence. I chose an empty seat in a prominent position reserved for major shareholders, directly opposite the chairman's chair. I sat down, motioning for my 2 children to sit on either side of me. The entire room buzzed with whispers. Who is she? Why did she bring children here? That boy looks exactly like Chairman Sterling when he was young. I smiled, placing my thick folder on the table. The battle had officially begun. Mr. Sterling walked into the meeting room, his face grim and menacing. He went straight to the podium, picked up the microphone, and tried to ignore my presence and that of my children. Dan, leaning on his crutches, followed and sat in the chairman's seat, but his mind seemed entirely focused on my children and me. He constantly glanced in our direction, his eyes filled with unspoken words. Distinguished shareholders, Mr. Sterling began sonorously, his voice echoing throughout the room. Today, we gather here under extremely urgent circumstances. Sterling Holdings is on the brink of an unprecedented crisis. Stock prices are plummeting, and investor confidence has collapsed. And the core reason, as you all know, lies in the instability of the highest leadership position. He pressed the remote, and the screen displayed large text, "Succession risk, uncertain future." A family-run corporation like ours cannot survive without generational continuity. Chairman Sterling has dedicated many years, we acknowledge that. But the recently leaked medical information proves that Dan is completely incapable of producing an heir due to congenital issues. If Mr. Sterling can never have children, who will steer this ship for the next 20 or 30 years? This instability will cause partners to withdraw, and banks to recall loans. For the survival of Sterling, I propose the removal of Mr. Daniel Sterling from the position of chairman and the election of a new leadership team with sufficient competence and stability. Sparse applause erupted from Mr. Sterling's faction. The neutral shareholders began to waver, whispering nervously, their faces anxious. Mr. Sterling's words struck at their greatest fear, losing money. Dan sat silently, offering no rebuttal. He knew his fatal weakness was the issue of succession. Before my appearance, he had almost given up, accepting defeat. "Does anyone have any comments?" "Mr. Sterling asked, a triumphant look on his face, preparing to proceed with the vote. "I have a comment." My voice rang out, clear but powerful, cutting through the suffocating atmosphere. I stood up, adjusted the lapel of my suit jacket, and looked straight at Mr. Sterling. The entire room turned its gaze towards me. "Who are you? This is a shareholders' meeting, not a place for outsiders to speak nonsense," Mr. Sterling shouted, trying to use his authority to crush me. "I am Amy Miller, Managing Director of Vision Capital Investment Fund," I said, articulating each word clearly. "And I am also an individual shareholder holding 5% of Sterling's shares. In total, I represent 15% of the voting power at this meeting. I believe I have every right to speak, Mr. Vice Chairman Sterling." Mr. Sterling froze. Vision Capital was a formidable Singaporean investment fund that he had tried to approach for a long time without success. He never expected its representative to be me. I walked from my seat slowly towards the podium. I plugged a USB into the presentation computer, taking control of the screen. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. Sterling needs stability and an heir," I said calmly. "But he is completely wrong about Sterling heading into a dead end. The risk he outlined has been thoroughly addressed right here, right now." I pressed the button to switch slides. The screen displayed 2 birth certificates and DNA test results, magnified. Father's name, Daniel Sterling. Children's names: Benjamin Sterling, Hannah Sterling. Conclusion: 99.99% blood relation. The entire room gasped in astonishment. Whispers erupted like a beehive. What? The chairman has children? Twins? A boy and a girl? So the infertility rumors were false. I turned and pointed to the two children sitting obediently in their chairs. Allow me to introduce to the distinguished shareholders, these are the two sole legitimate heirs of Chairman Daniel Sterling, Benjamin Sterling and Hannah Sterling. They are perfectly healthy, intelligent, and educated to the highest international standards. Their existence is irrefutable proof, shattering all distorted arguments about Sterling's future. Mr. Sterling's face drained of color. He stammered, "Forgery? It must be a forgery. You brought fake documents here to deceive everyone. Forgery or not. I invite the legal department and independent lawyers to verify immediately," I retorted sharply. "The originals are in my hand." Sarah stepped forward from the audience with a representative from an independent auditing firm to verify the documents right in front of everyone. After 5 tense minutes, the auditing representative nodded, confirming that the documents were entirely valid and accurate. Resounding applause broke out. This time, it came from the neutral shareholders and those who supported the Sterling family. A heavy psychological burden was lifted. Sterling's stock on the electronic board began to tick green again as soon as the news leaked out. Dan stood up and quickly walked towards me. He looked at me with immense gratitude, then turned to his two children and extended his arms wide. This time, he didn't hesitate. He hugged both of them tightly. "Ben, Hannah, I'm so sorry. My children," he said, his voice cracking. Ben was initially stiff, but then he too wrapped his arms around his father's neck. Hannah burst into tears of emotion. The image of the family reunited right in the middle of the shareholders' meeting created an extremely powerful media effect. I turned to Mr. Sterling, who was now trembling, sweat pouring down his face. "Mr. Sterling, your argument has been refuted. Now, as a strategic shareholder, I propose a new vote of confidence for Chairman Sterling, and I, representing 15% of the shares, vote to keep him in his position." Other shareholders raised their hands in agreement one by one. "I agree. I also agree." Mr. Sterling collapsed onto his chair. He knew he had lost this gamble completely. Not only had he lost the opportunity for a takeover, but he also faced investigation for market manipulation and spreading false rumors. I looked at Dan, happy with his children, and felt a sense of relief. I had done it. I had protected my children's assets. But the battle didn't end here. This was only the beginning of the demands I would make of Dan and his family. Dan looked up at me, his eyes filled with commitment. He understood that to have this day, I had paid with 8 years of my youth and tears, and he owed me a debt that could not be repaid with money. The meeting room was still abuzz, but the situation had completely changed. Shareholders who had once sided with Mr. Sterling now made a 180-degree turn, surrounding Dan and congratulating him as if they had never intended to betray him. That was the brutal and deceptive nature of the business world, where self-interest always came first. I remained in my seat, looking at my phone. Sarah had just sent me a quick report. Mr. Sterling's faction had heavily short-sold TMG shares, expecting the price to crash after Dan's removal so they could buy back cheap and profit from the difference. But my appearance and that of my children had caused the stock price to hit the upper limit immediately. A short squeeze was now in effect. To cut their losses, Mr. Sterling's faction was forced to buy back shares at any price, driving the price even higher. Mr. Sterling's family's assets were evaporating by tens of millions of dollars every minute. Mr. Sterling sat slumped in his chair, his hands trembling as he held a glass of water, unable to lift it to his mouth. Michael stood behind his father, his face pale, his eyes looking at me with both fear and hatred. "Dad," the brokerage firm called. "Our account is burning. They're demanding immediate additional margin deposits." Michael whispered into Mr. Sterling's ear, but in the silent room, everyone heard it clearly. Mr. Sterling dropped his glass of water to the floor, the sound of breaking glass shattering like his career itself. I stood up, adjusted Hannah's dress, and said loudly, "Distinguished guests, the meeting has concluded. I believe we should end here, so that Chairman Sterling can attend to family matters and stabilize his personnel. As for those who were foolish enough to short sell, I advise you to quickly find a way to rectify the consequences before it's too late." Dan nodded in agreement, declaring the meeting adjourned. He picked up Hannah, held Ben's hand, and walked towards me. "Thank you," Dan said, his eyes looking deeply into mine. "We need to talk." "Of course, we need to talk," I replied coldly. "But not here." Just then, the meeting room door burst open with a bang. A middle-aged woman, elegantly dressed and adorned with expensive jewelry, rushed in, looking distraught. It was Mrs. Sterling, Dan's mother. She had just heard the shocking news on the financial bulletin and immediately rushed here. Seeing Dan holding a little girl and leading a little boy who looked exactly like him, Mrs. Sterling froze, clutching her chest, her mouth agape, speechless. "Dan, is the rumor true?" Eleanor Sterling stammered. Dan looked at his mother, his eyes no longer showing the weakness of 8 years ago, but instead a stern and reproachful gaze. "Yes, Mom, these are your grandchildren," he said. "Ben and Hannah, my children and Amy's. Mrs. Sterling turned to look at me, her eyes meeting my sharp gaze. In her memory, I was a weak, easily bullied country girl, but the woman standing before her now exuded an aura of power that made her flinch. "Amy, you're back?" "Mrs." Sterling forced a strained smile, trying to approach me. "Mom, I'm so happy. I thought you would never have an heir." I raised my hand to stop her. "Excuse me, ma'am, I am not your daughter. I am a strategic partner of Sterling. And these 2 children," I pointed to Ben and Hannah, "they are my children. You have no right to approach them without my permission." "Mrs." Sterling was stunned, her face turning red with humiliation in front of so many people. You dare to speak to me like that? I am their grandmother, after all," she hissed, her ferocious nature re-emerging. "Grandmother?" I smiled faintly. 8 years ago, you were the one who drove their mother away when she was pregnant with them. You were the one who said my background was lowly, unworthy of your family. Now that you see they are valuable heirs, you claim them? There's no such easy thing in this world. I turned to Dan. "You deal with your family matters, Dan. My children and I will wait for you in the parking lot. We'll go to the old penthouse to negotiate." With that, I took Ben's hand and walked straight out, not bothering to look back at Mrs. Sterling, who stood frozen. I heard Dan's voice calling out from behind, sharp and firm, "Mom, go home. I'll talk to you later. Don't cause any more trouble here. I'm already too tired of your interference." I stepped into the elevator, feeling smug. This was just the prelude. The punishment for Mrs. Sterling was yet to come. Dan's chauffeur-driven SUV took us to the luxurious Riverside apartment complex in downtown Los Angeles. This was the place where, 8 years ago, Dan and I had briefly lived together the short, unhappy days of our marriage. The penthouse was on the highest floor, offering panoramic views of the entire city. When the door opened, I was surprised to see that everything inside was exactly as I had left it. Even my house slippers were neatly placed on the shoe rack. Our wedding photos still hung on the wall, though the glass was covered with a faint film of time's dust. Dan sat Hannah on the sofa, then poured water for me. He looked awkward, like a guest in his own home. "I kept everything the same," Dan said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "I always thought that one day you would come back." "Don't give me a sob story," I interrupted him, sitting in the chair opposite him, crossing my legs proudly. "We're here to talk business, not to dwell on past hardships." Dan sighed, sitting down next to Ben. The boy sat quietly, eyes observing the large apartment with curiosity. "All right, what do you want?" "I'll agree to everything," Dan said, his eyes sincere. "My assets, my shares, they're all yours and the children's." I took a pre-drafted contract from my handbag and pushed it towards him. "First, this penthouse must be transferred to my name immediately." I want my children to have the best living environment in the U.S., and this place meets that requirement." "Agreed," Dan nodded without hesitation. "I'll call my lawyer to handle the paperwork tomorrow." "Second," I continued, my voice firm, "I want you to sign a decision appointing me as CEO of Sterling's new venture capital fund with completely independent authority. I will hold 15% of the group's shares, drawn from your personal holdings, as collateral for the children's future." Dan looked at me, his eyes showing a flicker of surprise, then quickly turning to admiration. "You want financial control. That's right. I don't trust your family's management, especially with your mother's interference. I need to ensure that my children's assets are not lost." "I agree." Dan took the pen and signed the agreement. "You can even transfer all my shares to you." "I don't need charity," I replied coldly. "I'm only taking what's commensurate with the effort I put into raising my children for 8 years and the effort I put into saving you today." "Are there any other conditions?" Dan asked. "The third and most important condition." I looked straight into his eyes. "Eleanor Sterling must publicly apologize to me at the group's 30th anniversary gala next week. She must acknowledge her past mistakes, correct the malicious rumors that I was unfaithful or infertile that she spread for 8 years to defame my honor." Dan froze. He knew how proud his mother was. Asking her to apologize publicly in front of thousands of guests, and the media would be like killing her. My mother is very stubborn about this." Dan hesitated. "That's your problem." I stood up. "If she can't do it, I'll take the children back to New York immediately, and you will never see them again. You should remember that legally, I am their sole guardian. You don't have any rights over the children." Dan jumped up in a panic, grabbing my hand. "No, please, don't take the children away. I promise I'll make it happen. I'll make Mom apologize to you." I pulled my hand away from his, adjusting my suit jacket. "Good. I'll give you 1 week to arrange it. Now, my children and I need to rest. Please leave my home." Dan looked at me, then at the 2 children, who were yawning, tired after a long day. He knew he had no right to stay. "All right, I'll go. You and the children get some rest. I'll come visit the children tomorrow," Dan said, his voice full of reluctance. He bent down and kissed Ben and Hannah on the forehead, then quietly walked out the door. The door closed, separating 2 worlds. I sank onto the sofa, a wave of exhaustion washing over me, but looking at my 2 children dozing off, I knew I had won the first battle. The next morning, Dan returned to the penthouse very early, carrying various breakfast foods and toys. He rang the doorbell tentatively, like a delivery person afraid of being scolded by a customer. I opened the door, dressed in comfortable loungewear, but my face was still cold. "You're early. The children aren't awake yet," I said. "I bought bagels from that diner you used to love the most." Dan held up a bag of food, smiling tentatively. "I remember you don't like onions, and you prefer less grease." I looked at the bagels, and memories flooded back. In the past, whenever I had morning sickness, I craved bagels from that diner. Dan used to buy them for me, but he always sent his assistant, and they always got the wrong kind with onions, making me pick them out painstakingly. "Did you go yourself this time?" "Come in." I stepped aside to let him in. Dan tiptoed in, placing the food on the table. He looked around and saw Ben awake, reading a book in the corner of the room. "Morning, son," Dan waved. Ben looked up and nodded back. "Hello, sir." "Oh, wait, hello, Dad." The word Dad coming from the boy's mouth made Dan overjoyed. He rushed over and sat down next to his son. "What are you reading? A book about investing?" "Yes, I'm learning about Japanese candlestick patterns," Ben replied matter-of-factly. "Dad, why did our company's stock price hit the upper limit yesterday? Was it due to the FOMO effect from the crowd?" Dan's mouth hung open. He never expected his son to speak with such deep professional insight. Well, yes, partly due to FOMO, but mainly because investor confidence returned when they learned that Dad has such an excellent heir as you." Dan ruffled his son's hair, his eyes filled with love. I sat at the dining table, watching the father and son talk, feeling a slight stir in my heart. Dan was genuinely trying, but the emotional wounds from 8 years ago were too deep to heal in a day or two. Eat breakfast first, then talk, I reminded them. During the meal, Dan kept stealing glances at me. Finally, he mustered up the courage to ask, Amy, how have you been living for the past 8 years? Sarah told me you work at Vision Capital, but how could you raise 2 small children and climb to such a high position? I put my fork down and looked him straight in the eyes. It was time for him to know the cost of his indifference. Do you think your mother's $500,000 was a lot? That money was only enough for me to rent a place and give birth in New York for the first year. Ben and Hannah were born prematurely and had to spend 2 months in an incubator. Hospital bills wiped out all my savings. Dan's face turned pale, and he dropped his fork. Premature? I had no idea. How could you know when you were busy with celebratory dinners for new contracts? I smiled bitterly. I had to wash dishes for restaurants in Chinatown and take on laundry at night to earn every penny for the children's milk. There were days I only ate 1 sandwich to save money for Hannah's medicine because she was often sick. Tears began to stream down Dan's face. He was a powerful man, commanding influence in the business world, but now he cried like a child in front of his ex-wife. I carried 1 child on my back while studying. I took the CFA exam while Hannah lay beside me with a high fever. I started as an unpaid intern, being bossed around, pushed to the limits because I was an immigrant single mother. But I didn't give up, because every time I saw my children, I told myself I had to succeed. I had to become richer than the entire Sterling family who cast my children and me aside. I'm sorry 1,000 times. Dan buried his head in his hands on the table, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. I'm such a fool. I don't deserve to be a father. Ben and Hannah, seeing their father cry, were frightened and ran to hug him. Dad, don't cry, Hannah whimpered, taking a tissue to wipe her father's tears. Mom, don't scold Dad anymore. I sighed at the sight. I didn't mean to scold him. I just wanted him to understand this raw truth, that his money couldn't buy back those arduous days. Get up, I said, my voice softer. What good will crying do? If you truly feel guilty, use the rest of your life to make it up to our children. Don't let them suffer any more pain. Dan looked up, his eyes red but full of determination. I swear to you, from now on, anyone who dares to hurt you or our children will have to go through me, even if it's my own mother. I nodded. This time, I believed him, because in his eyes, I saw the awakening of a true man. 3 days later, in the chairman's private office, Dan and I sat opposite each other. But this time, the atmosphere was no longer as tense as in the penthouse, but purely professional. Sarah was also present as my legal representative, meticulously reviewing every clause in the thick contract. Everything is in order. Sarah folded the file and pushed it towards Dan. You just need to sign here, and it's done. 15% of your personal shares will be transferred to a trust fund for Ben and Hannah, with Amy named as the managing trustee until the children turn 18. Simultaneously, the decision to appoint Amy as CEO of the Vision Sterling Fund will also take effect immediately. Dan took the pen and signed without hesitation, even though the value of the assets he had just transferred amounted to billions of dollars. It's done. Dan handed the file back to me. Now we are official partners. I took the folder, feeling its weight in my hands. This wasn't just money, it was my children's future. Thank you for your cooperation, I said professionally. I will begin restructuring the investment portfolio next week. Sterling is currently holding too much unsold real estate. We need to liquidate some of it to funnel capital into tech and renewable energy. Dan nodded in agreement. I completely trust your vision. I've wanted to do this for years, but the old board was too conservative. Now with you and the foreign investment funds supporting us, it will be easier to implement. Don't celebrate too soon, I reminded him. There's still one important matter left unresolved. Dan understood what I was referring to. He pondered for a moment, then said, Tonight I'll go to the main house and talk to Mom. I've invited all the elders of the family to be present. I want to resolve this definitively before the gala. I looked at him, my eyes scrutinizing. Are you sure? Eleanor Sterling isn't easy to change. I know, Dan clenched his fists, but this time I have no other choice. I lost you once because of my weakness. I cannot lose my children again." I stood up and adjusted my jacket. "Good. I'll await good news from you. If it's not resolved tonight, I'll book plane tickets tomorrow morning." "It will be resolved," Dan affirmed confidently. I walked out of the room, secretly hoping he would succeed. After all, Ben and Hannah needed a grandmother if she was willing to change her ways. But if she remained stubborn, I wouldn't hesitate to cut off this toxic relationship permanently. The Sterling family estate, secluded in a luxurious neighborhood like Bel Air, stood like a magnificent mansion but always exuded a cold atmosphere. That evening, Dan returned, carrying an unprecedented determination. In the spacious living room, Eleanor Sterling sat on a lavishly carved chair, her face grim and hostile. Surrounding her were the elders of the family, whom Dan had invited to witness. "You're so clever, Dan." Eleanor Sterling slammed her hand on the table as soon as she saw her son enter. "You dare to bring family matters out for everyone to gossip about? You're forcing me to apologize to that disrespectful daughter-in-law in front of everyone? I'd rather die than suffer such humiliation." Dan calmly sat in the opposite chair, unfazed by his mother's fury. "Mom, I'm not forcing you. I'm simply asking you to do the right thing. 8 years ago, you were wrong to drive Amy away. You were wrong to spread false rumors to defame her honor. Now you need to make amends. What was I wrong about?" Eleanor Sterling shrieked. She came from a low background, not a suitable match. "I drove her away for your own good, for the good of this family. Who knew she would hide her pregnancy and then come back using the children to extort money?" "Enough, Mom," Dan roared, startling everyone in the room into silence. This was the first time he had ever raised his voice at his mother. "Amy is not extorting us. She is now a talented investor. Her assets might even be more than this family's cash. She came back to save me, to save Sterling from Mr. Sterling. And more importantly, she single-handedly raised your 2 grandchildren into intelligent, well-behaved individuals without a single penny from the Sterling family." Dan looked around at the elders, then continued, his voice softer. "You've all seen Ben and Hannah. They are the future of the Sterling family. But Amy has set a condition. If Mom doesn't publicly apologize and clear her name, she will take the children back to New York and change their last names. Our family will lose its grandchildren forever." The elderly relatives began to whisper. To them, having heirs to carry on the family name was paramount. Eleanor, one of the uncles, spoke up. "Dan is right. The grandchildren are grown and so bright. Don't let your personal pride cause the family to lose its blessing. What you did back then was indeed excessive." Eleanor Sterling glared at the uncle, but her resolve began to waver. She feared losing face, but she feared losing her direct heirs even more. If Dan truly had no children, she would become the family's disgrace. "But if you make me apologize in front of thousands of people, how can I ever show my face again?" Eleanor Sterling's voice softened. She began to bargain. "What if I apologize to her privately at her home?" "No," Dan said firmly. "Amy needs transparency. Her honor was publicly defamed, so it must be publicly restored. Mom, this is your last chance. If you don't do it, I will resign as chairman, hand over all of Sterling to outside management, and move to New York to live with my wife and children. I will never return to this cold house again." "Mrs. Sterling was stunned. She knew her son's character. He had always been gentle and submissive, but once he made a decision, not even an army could change his mind. She looked into Dan's eyes and saw a frightening distance. She realized that if she didn't yield, she would lose everything: her son, her grandchildren, and her support in old age. The room fell into stifling silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed like a countdown to judgment. Finally, Eleanor Sterling dropped her hands, her body slumping like a withered leaf. "All right, I'll do it. I'll apologize." Dan breathed a sigh of relief. He stood up, bowed to the elders, and then quickly walked out the door. He needed to tell Amy the news immediately. After successfully overcoming the most difficult hurdle, Eleanor Sterling, Dan began his campaign to win over the two most challenging clients in his life, Ben and Hannah. He realized that buying them expensive toys was meaningless. Ben didn't like superheroes. He preferred books and complex building models. Hannah, though she liked dolls, valued time spent playing together more than the toys themselves. On Saturday afternoon, Dan arrived at the penthouse with a laptop and a projector instead of a bulky bag of gifts. "What are you doing, Dad?" Hannah asked curiously as she watched Dan busily set up a projection screen in the middle of the living room. "Today, Dad has an important presentation," Dan winked mysteriously, inviting the two little investors and Mom Amy to sit down. I chuckled at his exaggerated seriousness, but was also curious about what trick he was up to. My children and I sat on the sofa. Dan adjusted his tie, picked up the remote, and began his slideshow. The screen displayed large, colorful text, "Project Awesome Sunday." "Distinguished guests," Dan said sonorously, as if addressing a board meeting. "Today, I present a proposal for an outdoor excursion tomorrow. The project's objectives are fun, safety, and bonding." He advanced the slide. The next slide showed images of a camping site at Big Bear Lake with detailed activities. 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., travel by specialized vehicle with a comfortable car seat for Mom Amy. 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., tent setup and fishing competition. Prize, a limited edition Lego set for Ben. 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., outdoor BBQ party. Menu approved by Chef Hannah. 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., kayaking and sunset viewing. Dan presented enthusiastically, even analyzing risks, rain, mosquito bites, and preventive measures, umbrellas, insect repellent. He also included cheerful sound effects that made Hannah giggle. Ben sat with his arms crossed, listening intently, occasionally nodding with a thoughtful expression. Concluding the presentation, I await feedback from our investors. Dan wiped the sweat from his forehead, nervously awaiting their response. Hannah raised her hand first. "I agree. I want to grill hot dogs." Dan breathed half a sigh of relief, then turned to look at Ben. The boy pushed up his glasses, though he didn't need them for vision, only wearing blue light filtering ones for coolness. "The plan is quite detailed, but I have a question. Do you know how to set up a tent, Dad? According to the data I've collected, you're a pampered rich boy who's never done manual labor." I burst out laughing, almost choking on my water. This boy was truly a killer with his sharp questions. Dan's face turned red, and he scratched his head. "Well, actually, I've never set one up before, but I watched YouTube tutorials all night. Besides, aren't we a team? We'll do it together. Dad will be responsible for carrying heavy items, and you'll be responsible for technical direction, all right?" Ben thought for a moment, then nodded. "Acceptable. I'll approve this project, but if the tent collapses, you get a deduction in your credibility score." "Agreed!" Dan cheered as if he had just won a multi-million-dollar project bid. I looked at the three of them, feeling an unusual warmth in my heart. Dan had shed the ego of a cold CEO to become an ordinary, clumsy, but determined father. Perhaps my decision to return was the right one, not just for the assets, but also for these simple, happy moments for my children. After the camping trip, which was more successful than expected, even though it took Dan almost 2 hours to set up the crooked tent, the father-child relationship had significantly improved. Ben started calling him Dad more naturally, and Hannah clung to Dan constantly. A week later, the transfer of the penthouse ownership was complete. My children and I officially became the legal owners of this apartment. I decided to change all the interior decor, erasing the gloomy traces of the past, transforming it into a brighter and more modern space. Dan also made a surprising decision. He bought the apartment directly below ours to easily visit the children. "This way, we'll be neighbors." Dan happily showed me the keys to his new place. "Every morning, I can come up to take the children to school, and in the evening, I can come up to help them with homework without disturbing your privacy." I raised an eyebrow at him. "You've thought this through, haven't you? But remember to keep your distance. Neighbors should only be cordial." I know, Dan chuckled. But neighbors help each other out. If you need anything, just give me a shout. Our neighborly life began quite interestingly. Dan kept his word, never entering my home without permission. He often waited in the elevator lobby each morning to pick up Ben and Hannah for school. The sight of the powerful CEO, carrying a pink backpack and a superhero water bottle, waiting for the elevator, became a lively topic of conversation among the building's residents. One evening, a pipe burst in my kitchen, flooding the floor. I fumbled around, but couldn't shut off the main valve because it was stuck tight. In my distress, I called Dan. "Hello, are you home? Come up and help me." "The kitchen's flooded," I said urgently. Less than 2 minutes later, Dan had appeared at my door, still in his pajama set, carrying a toolbox. "All right, let me see." Dan rolled up his sleeves and rushed into the kitchen. He lay down on the wet floor, crawled under the kitchen cabinet, and began to twist the water valve. Looking at his broad back, stained with dirty water, dripping with sweat, I suddenly felt a pang in my heart. Before, Dan would never have touched such tasks. He always had housekeepers or called a repairman. Done. Dan emerged, his face smudged but smiling brightly. This valve was rusted shut from old age. Tomorrow, I'll call a plumber to replace the entire water system for you to ensure safety. I handed him a clean towel. "Thank you. Go change before you catch a cold." Dan wiped his face, then looked at me hesitantly. "Amy, I know you haven't completely forgiven me, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. Not to win you over, but because I want to become a responsible man, a deserving father, and a husband." I looked at him, my gaze softening slightly. "I acknowledge your efforts, but once trust is broken, it takes a lot of time to mend. Just focus on being a good father for now." Dan nodded. "I'll wait. However long it takes." He gathered his tools and quietly walked out the door. His lonely figure under the dim hallway light made me ponder a bit. Perhaps people truly grow only after experiencing loss. The day of Sterling Holdings' 30th anniversary gala arrived. The event was held at the city's largest convention center, with thousands of guests, strategic partners, and media representatives in attendance. I chose a wine-red evening gown. Its off-the-shoulder design was alluring yet elegant, enhancing my fair skin and slender figure. My hair was lightly curled, flowing softly. Today, I came not only as a partner but also as a victor. Dan picked up my children and me in a luxurious limousine. He wore a dashing tuxedo, looking like a prince from a fairy tale. Ben and Hannah were also dressed in cute formal wear, like two little angels. "You look beautiful," Dan whispered as he helped me out of the car. "Thank you," I replied cordially, but secretly pleased by his compliment. As we stepped onto the red carpet, the photographer's flashes went off continuously like lightning. The appearance of Chairman Sterling's family, along with his mysterious ex-wife and their twin children, became the center of all attention. Eleanor Sterling had arrived early. She wore a black velvet gown embroidered with gold patterns, her face meticulously made up, yet still unable to hide her anxiety and tension. When she saw us, she trembled slightly but quickly regained her composure. The ceremony proceeded grandly with speeches about the group's history and development. But everyone understood that the most important, most dramatic part was being saved for the end of the program. After his own speech, Dan held the microphone and spoke in a deep, warm voice. "Distinguished guests, today is a special day. Not just Sterling's anniversary, but also a day when I want to share a personal story, a truth that has been buried for 8 years. I would like to respectfully invite my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, to the stage." The entire hall fell silent. Eleanor Sterling stepped onto the stage, her steps slightly unsteady. Dan went to support his mother, his eyes looking at her with encouragement but also firm resolve. Mrs. Sterling held the microphone, her hand trembling. She looked down at where I was sitting with my 2 children. My gaze met hers, calm, not resentful, but also unyielding. "Distinguished guests," Eleanor Sterling's voice wavered. "Today, before everyone present, I want to offer my sincerest apologies to my former daughter-in-law, Miss Amy Miller." Whispers began to rise. 8 years ago, due to my short-sightedness and narrow-minded prejudices, I took actions and spoke words that offended Amy's honor, forcing her to leave our family while she carried the Sterling family's blood. I also made a mistake by allowing false rumors to spread, causing her deep pain. Eleanor Sterling paused, took a deep breath, and tears began to well up. Perhaps they were tears of humiliation, but also perhaps tears of belated regret. Amy is a resilient and talented woman. She single-handedly raised my 2 grandchildren. I take full responsibility for all my mistakes and hope she can forgive me. I also officially recognize Ben and Hannah as the direct heirs of the Sterling family, the legitimate successors of Sterling Holdings. Mrs. Sterling bowed deeply to me, and the entire hall erupted in applause. Tears streamed down Dan's cheeks. He had done it. He had restored my honor. I stood up, took my children's hands, and walked onto the stage. I didn't embrace Mrs. Sterling, nor did I offer empty words of forgiveness. I simply accepted a glass of champagne from a server and raised it high. Thank you for your apology. The past is behind us. Let it rest. Today, let's raise a toast to Sterling's growth and the future of these children. My action was highly praised by the media as civilized and classy conduct. The photo of me standing on stage, proud and magnanimous, beside Dan and our 2 children, became the cover page of economic magazines the next morning. After the sensational gala night, I officially began my work at the Vision Sterling Fund. My office was on the 66th floor, just below the chairman's office, with a modern design and a spectacular panoramic view. On my first day, I called an emergency meeting with all senior personnel of the fund. The atmosphere in the meeting room was tense. Everyone knew the reputation of Amy, the financial shark returning from New York, known for being cold and decisive. I slammed a stack of personnel reports onto the table with a thud. Who is responsible for recruiting personnel over the past 2 years? I asked, my voice icy. A pot-bellied, red-faced, middle-aged man stood up. He was a distant cousin of Mr. Sterling, planted here to earn a high salary without doing anything. That would be me, Director, he replied with a contemptuous look. Is there a problem? A very big problem. I flipped through the files. In the list of 50 employees of the fund, 20 are children, grandchildren, or relatives of board members. Most have no relevant professional qualifications. Their work performance is almost zero, yet they receive exorbitant salaries and bonuses. How dare you say that? We are all family members. You can't, he stammered in protest. Here, there are no family members. Only people who can do the job and people who can't. I cut him off. I announced that effective tomorrow, all 20 of these employees will be terminated. The HR department will process contract compensation according to labor law. As for you, HR director, you are fired for gross negligence resulting in serious consequences. You have no right. I'll complain to Chairman Sterling, he shrieked. Feel free, I smirked. Chairman Sterling has granted me full authority over the fund's personnel decisions. If you wish to sue, I am prepared to go to court. But I warn you, if we investigate further into the HR department's questionable expenses, you might not just lose your job but also end up in prison. His face turned pale. He mumbled incoherently, then hastily gathered his belongings and left the room. The entire meeting room fell silent. No one dared to breathe heavily. The remaining employees, those who genuinely had abilities but had been suppressed for so long, looked at me with admiration and respect. I continued the meeting, introducing extremely strict new KPIs, establishing iron discipline regarding attendance and work ethic. My goal was for Vision Sterling Fund to be among the top 3 most effective investment funds in the U.S. within 1 year. Anyone who feels they cannot keep up with this pace can submit their resignation now. I need warriors, not sheep. After the meeting, I stepped out of the room to find Dan waiting in the hallway. He had heard everything through the surveillance system. You did great, Dan applauded, his eyes full of pride. I've wanted to get rid of those freeloaders for a long time, but I was always entangled by family relations. You truly are the sharp sword I needed. Don't praise me yet. I handed him another folder. This is a list of unprofitable real estate projects, Mr. Sterling invested in. I recommend selling them immediately at a loss to recover capital. One pain, then it's over. Dan took the folder and nodded. Approved. I trust your intuition and analysis. Seeing Dan trust me implicitly, I felt a surge of positive energy within me. We were not just the parents of our children, but also effective teammates in the business world. This relationship was perhaps even more enduring than romantic love. Work at the group was busy, but Dan never forgot his most important duty: being a father. He seemed to be racing against time to make up for the 8 lost years with his children. Every day, he tried to come home a little earlier so he could play or help them with homework. Ben had recently taken a liking to playing chess at his dad's house. The two of them could sit in silence for hours over the chessboard, pondering difficult moves. Dan was surprised to see Ben's tactical thinking was as sharp as that of some of the toughest business opponents he had ever faced. "I lost," Dan said with a wry smile after Ben checkmated him in just 20 moves. "Who taught you to play so well?" "I learned online, and I read strategy books by Kasparov," Ben replied, his eyes still on the board. "You play too emotionally, Dad. You often reveal weaknesses when you try to attack. Is it the same in business?" Dan froze at his son's observation. The boy had hit a nerve. He often acted impulsively and sometimes made decisions based on emotions, something Amy always reminded him to overcome. "You're right," Dan nodded, admitting, "I'll learn from this. You truly are my little advisor." Meanwhile, Hannah enjoyed gardening with her dad on the balcony. Dan had transformed his apartment balcony into a small garden with various roses and organic vegetables. Every afternoon, father and daughter would be busy watering plants and picking off bugs. "Dad, this rose bush is blooming," Hannah exclaimed excitedly. "Isn't it beautiful, honey?" Dan asked tenderly, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "It's so beautiful. Mom Amy loves roses too. She used to draw roses in her notebook," Hannah recounted. Dan felt a pang in his heart. He remembered he had never given Amy roses. He always thought they were silly and pointless. Now he understood that sometimes women only needed such simple things. "So, how about Hannah picks a rose for Mom sometime? Say it's from Hannah to Mom," Dan winked. "Okay," Hannah giggled. Watching my children happily with their father, I stood on my own balcony, feeling relieved. Dan was changing for the better every day. He was more patient, a better listener, and especially, he was more considerate of others' feelings. Perhaps the time apart had taught him a valuable lesson about appreciation. However, I still maintained a certain distance. I was afraid that if I opened my heart too soon, I would be hurt again. I needed more time to verify if his changes were lasting. That day, it poured rain, an unseasonal Los Angeles downpour that made the air damp and chilly. I was working at the office when I received a call from Dan's assistant, informing me that he had a high fever and had left work at noon. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to call him. The phone rang for a long time before someone picked up. "Hello?" Dan's voice was hoarse and weak. "How are you doing?" "I heard you're sick," I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I'm just a little tired, probably from being caught in the rain yesterday while inspecting a project." "Don't worry, I've taken medicine," Dan said, a dry cough echoing through the phone. "Have you eaten anything yet?" "No. I don't want to eat anything. Everything tastes bitter," I silled. How old was this man, still acting like a child when he was sick, not knowing how to take care of himself? "All right, lie down and rest. I'll be over in a bit." I hung up, finished my work, and left early. I stopped by the supermarket to buy some ingredients for a classic American comfort food. Back home, I cooked a comforting bowl of chicken noodle soup. Ben and Hannah, seeing me cook soup, eagerly asked, "Is Dad sick, Mom? Can we go visit Dad?" Hannah worried. "After dinner, Mom will take you." "Now eat quickly," I urged. My children and I went to Dan's apartment. The apartment was dark, with only the dim yellow light of a bedside lamp in the bedroom. Dan lay slumped in bed, his forehead hot. "Dad!" Hannah ran over and touched his forehead. "You're so hot!" Dan opened his eyes. saw my children and me, and forced a weak smile. "You came? I'm fine." "Stay still," I ordered, placing the steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup on the table. "Eat some soup to sweat it out." Dan looked at the steaming soup, his eyes brimming with tears. "You cooked this for me? Who else would?" "Eat quickly before it gets cold," I said curtly, to hide my concern. Dan sat up and ate the soup spoon by spoon. He ate it heartily, as if he had never tasted anything so good. Beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. "It's delicious." "Thank you," Dan said, his voice less hoarse. "Dad, after you eat, take your medicine. I'll get you some water." Ben quickly ran to pour water. Seeing his two children take care of him, Dan was moved beyond words. He clasped my hand as I went to clear the bowl. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to feel this family atmosphere. For 8 years, I lived in luxury but was terribly lonely. Today is the happiest day of my life." I intended to pull my hand away, but seeing his hand hot and trembling, I decided against it. "Get well soon. You still need to work to earn money to raise our children. Don't just lie there complaining," I said, but my voice had softened considerably. That night, I let the two children sleep with their father. Although Dan's fever had subsided, I returned to my own apartment. Lying in bed, I tossed and turned. The image of a weak Dan, his earnest eyes, haunted me. Perhaps the icy wall around my heart was melting faster than I thought. Life's tranquility was short-lived before storms erupted again. That morning, upon arriving at the company, I saw employees whispering and pointing at their phones. Sarah rushed into my office, her face pale. "Amy, there's big trouble. Check the internet right now." I opened my phone. On social media, forums, and tabloid news sites, an anonymous article was spreading rapidly with a sensational headline: "Doubt cast on Sterling CEO's children. A bloodline hoax to grab assets?" The article put forth distorted and fabricated claims that I had conceived children via artificial insemination abroad with another man, or even adopted children, to return and defraud the Sterling family's inheritance. They even photoshopped pictures of Ben and Hannah, with some unknown man for comparison, making malicious comments about the children's appearance. My blood boiled. They could attack me, but if they dared to touch my children, I would not let it go. "Is this Mr. Sterling's faction playing games?" I asked Sarah, my hand clutching my phone. "Highly likely. He's dying to save himself, trying to use dirty media tactics to undermine Dan's and your reputation before the upcoming annual shareholders meeting," Sarah assessed. "Contact the legal department and cybersecurity immediately to track down the IP of the poster. I want to sue them for defamation," I ordered. Just then, the office door burst open. Dan walked in, his face set with anger, but his eyes exuded a frightening calmness. "You don't need to do anything. I'll handle it," Dan said firmly. "What are you going to do?" "The rumors are spreading very fast, affecting the children's psyche," I worried. "I'll hold a press conference this afternoon. I'll show them the price they have to pay for daring to touch Daniel Sterling's children." That afternoon, a snap press conference was held in the company's grand lobby. Dan appeared with a cold, imposing demeanor. He didn't come alone, but with representatives from the Forensic Science Institute and the chief legal officer. "I do not usually discuss my private life," Dan began before hundreds of cameras, "but there are despicable individuals who dare to attack innocent children. That is a line I will not allow anyone to cross." He then disclosed the complete DNA test results performed by 3 of the world's most reputable forensic centers with consular notarization. "This is the truth, and this is the final warning." Dan held up another folder. "We have identified the identity of the rumor monger and the mastermind behind it. The case files have been handed over to the investigative authorities. These individuals will face prison sentences for defamation and child endangerment." Dan looked directly into the camera lenses, his gaze sharp as a knife, directed at the one in the shadows. "Do not test my patience. If you dare to touch my wife and children again, I will make sure you have nowhere left to hide on this earth." Dan's resolute declaration immediately quelled all rumors. Online communities rallied to support him, praising him as a courageous father and husband. I watched the live stream from my office, tears falling uncontrollably. For the first time in so many years, I felt protected. I no longer had to struggle to be a shark protecting my children, because there was now a strong mountain standing before my children and me. After the media crisis, Mr. Sterling's family completely collapsed. The investigative agency stepped in, uncovering a series of financial irregularities and market manipulation by his faction. Mr. Sterling was temporarily detained, while Michael went into hiding due to gambling debts and being pursued by loan sharks. Sterling Holdings was purged and entered its most glorious period of development. Under Dan's leadership and my astute financial support, TMG stock continuously broke historical records. But what was more important was the atmosphere in our family. On weekends, we often held small barbecue parties on the rooftop. Mrs. Sterling had now completely changed. She frequently visited her grandchildren, bringing all sorts of treats and snacks. She no longer scrutinized me but showed respect, even a hint of awe. "Amy, I cooked your favorite pot roast. Eat a lot to have energy for work," Eleanor Sterling said, serving me food with an affectionate tone. "Thank you," I replied. Although I wasn't quite used to this change, I was no longer as harsh as before. Ben and Hannah clung to their grandmother, watching Mrs. Sterling smiled toothlessly as she listened to her grandchildren talk about school. I realized that forgiveness was sometimes not for others, but for oneself, to achieve liberation. Dan sat beside me, silently observing everything. He didn't say much, only occasionally smiled and served food to my children and me. His eyes looked at me with deep gratitude and love. We were like broken pieces that had been mended, still bearing faint scars, but more inseparable than ever. We understood each other's value, understood the value of family after all the storms. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Dan and I sat on the balcony, drinking wine. The river breeze blew refreshingly. "Do you regret coming back?" Dan asked. "There are times when I'm tired," yes, I admitted. "But seeing the children happy, I feel I made the right decision, and I feel like I'm the luckiest man on earth." Dan clasped my hand. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make amends. Thank you for giving me two angels." I didn't pull my hand away. I left it in his warm grasp. "You still owe me a lot, you know. You'll have to keep paying me back for the rest of your life," I teased. "I'm willing to pay forever." Dan squeezed my hand gently. "How do we calculate the interest?" "Madam CEO of Vision, emotional interest is compounded exponentially," I chuckled. 1 year after my return, Sterling Holdings held a strategic partnership signing ceremony with a major U.S. tech conglomerate. The ceremony was a resounding success, marking Sterling's leap onto the global stage. After the ceremony, Dan invited me to dinner. Not at a fancy restaurant, but at the casual burger joint where we used to have dates during our college days. "You still remember this place?" I asked, surprised to see the diner still bustling as it used to be. "How could I forget? This is where I first confessed my feelings for you." Dan smiled, pulling out a chair for me. We ate burgers, drank sodas, and talked about the old days, about happy and sad memories. There was no longer the distance of status or money, only two people who had weathered the storm and found their way back to each other. As he drove me back to the apartment building lobby, Dan unexpectedly took out a ring box. It wasn't $1 million diamond ring, but a simple silver band engraved with the names of our two children. Dan looked at me, his eyes sincere. "I know we've signed many business contracts, but there's one most important contract I want to sign with you again." He knelt on one knee, just as he had 8 years ago, but this time with far greater maturity and earnestness. "This investment deal in our family, may I ask for a lifetime contract extension? I promise to be a loyal, devoted, and unconditionally loving partner to you." I looked at the ring, then at the man before me, my heart beating with anticipation. I had waited for this moment for a very long time, not from the Dan of the past, but from the Dan of the present. I smiled, extending my hand for him to put on the ring. "This contract has very heavy penalties for breach, you know. If you ever dare to make me sad again, I'll fine you your entire fortune. I accept all risks." Dan kissed my hand, then stood up and pulled me into a hug. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ben and Hannah, probably secretly using their grandmother's iPad. "Mommy, say yes, Mommy! Dad promised us ice cream!" I burst into happy laughter in Dan's arms. Life is a series of fluctuating days, but as long as we know how to cherish and correct our mistakes, happiness will always smile at the end of the road. My return was not just the return of a discarded wife, but the return of love, responsibility, and a complete family. The story of Amy and Dan concludes, leaving a powerful message about self-worth and forgiveness. It demonstrates that the most elegant form of retribution for a woman is not to seek to destroy her ex, but to strive to cultivate herself to become brave, wealthy, and brilliantly happy. When a woman holds knowledge and financial independence in her hands, she does not need to bow down and beg for affection, but compels others to show her absolute respect. Most importantly, the story is also a lesson in awakening. Money can be a means to protect loved ones, but only presence, responsibility, and compassion are truly capable of healing emotional wounds and keeping a family genuinely whole through all storms. Dear listeners who have accompanied me until the end of my story, how did you find today's tale? I'm curious about the impression it has left in your hearts and the thoughts it has sparked in you. Please feel free to share your impressions and opinions in the comments. I will carefully read each of them. The likes and subscriptions you give me are the greatest source of strength and motivation for creating better stories in the future. Please don't forget to do so. I sincerely wish that your life is always filled with happiness and good fortune, and that the warm light in your hearts never fades.